Rick was a 22-year-old American young man. He had just graduated from college and was looking for a job in his field of study, engineering. He lived with his parents in a small town in the state of Ohio, where he had spent most of his life. One fine day, Rick went to a nearby supermarket to buy some things for his mother. He was distracted by his phone, checking some messages, when he was approached by two police officers. "Rick, you're under arrest," the police officers said. Rick was stunned, not understanding what was happening. "Arrested? But I didn't do anything," he said. The police officers, however, did not give him any explanation. They simply handcuffed him and took him to the police station. Rick couldn't believe what was happening. He was being arrested for no apparent reason. At the police station, Rick was informed that he had been mistaken for a dangerous criminal who was being sought by the police. The criminal's name was Nick, and according to the police, he looked very similar to Rick. Rick was shocked. He had never heard of Nick, let alone looked like him. But the police did not want to hear his explanations. They were convinced that Rick was the criminal they were looking for. During the interrogation, Rick tried to explain that they were making a mistake, but he was ignored. The police were determined to arrest him and make him the scapegoat for the crime Nick had committed. Rick was thrown into a dark and dirty cell, where he spent the next 24 hours. He had no idea what was going on outside, and had no idea how to prove his innocence. The next morning, Rick was taken to a preliminary hearing, where a judge would decide whether he should be kept in custody or released on bail. Still not understanding what was happening, Rick was taken to the courtroom where the judge awaited him. The judge was a middle-aged, serious, and authoritarian man. He looked at Rick with disdain, as if he were already convicted. "Your name is Rick?" asked the judge. "Yes, sir," Rick replied. "You are charged with a serious crime. Do you understand the gravity of the charges against you?" "No, sir. I have never done anything wrong," Rick said. "You can deny it as much as you want, but the evidence is against you," said the judge, with a smirk. "You look a lot like the suspect we are looking for. In addition, we found a weapon in your house that may have been used in the crime. You are guilty." Rick was shocked. He couldn't believe they were doing this to him. He had never seen this weapon in his life and didn't understand how it could have been used in the crime. "Please, Your Honor, I didn't commit any crime," Rick begged. "You need to give me a chance to prove my innocence." "The time to prove your innocence will be at trial," said the judge. "For now, you will be held in custody without bail. The hearing is adjourned." Rick was devastated. He couldn't believe he was being treated this way. He was taken back to his cell where he was held for the next few days. Meanwhile, his parents were desperate. They couldn't believe their son had been arrested. They hired a lawyer to try to prove Rick's innocence, but the task would not be easy. Rick's defense lawyer was aware of the charges against him and knew that he would have to gather solid evidence to prove his client's innocence. He began investigating the crime on his own, visiting the crime scene and interviewing witnesses. After several weeks of investigation, Rick's defense lawyer found a suspect who could be the real Nick. He was a man who lived nearby and looked a lot like Nick, the real criminal. The lawyer presented this new evidence to the judge, who agreed to hear his argument. He argued that the police had arrested the wrong young man and that the real criminal was still at large. After hearing the defense lawyer's argument, the judge decided to release Rick on bail, but he would have to remain under house arrest until the trial. Rick was relieved, but he also knew that he still had to prove his innocence in court. The trial was scheduled for 2 months later, and Rick spent those 2 months preparing for the day he would have to appear in court. He knew that this would be his last chance to prove his innocence and clear his name. On the day of the trial, Rick and his lawyer arrived at the court with several pieces of evidence pointing to the real Nick as the true culprit. They presented witness testimonies that saw Nick at the scene of the crime on the night of the incident, as well as photos of Nick that showed he looked very similar to Rick. The prosecution attempted to argue that the evidence was insufficient to prove Rick's innocence, but the judge ultimately agreed with the defense. He acquitted Rick of all charges and issued a warrant for the real Nick's arrest. Rick had finally proven his innocence, and his name was cleared. He and his parents were relieved and grateful for the help of the defense lawyer who fought for him and for justice. They hugged and cried together, grateful for having overcome this difficult situation. Although it was a traumatic experience, Rick learned a lot from it. He realized that life can be unpredictable and that one never knows what the future holds. He also realized how important it is to have a good support team around you, such as his parents and defense lawyer, who fought tirelessly for his innocence. After the trial, Rick decided to use his experience to help others who were going through the same kind of situation. He got involved in civil rights organizations and started volunteering at law firms. He also made an effort to stay in touch with his friends in prison, many of whom were victims of the criminal justice system. He wrote letters to them and visited whenever possible, bringing words of encouragement and hope. 1 year after being unjustly arrested, Rick received a letter from the local police department. It was an apology for the mistake made in his arrest and an offer of financial compensation. Rick was surprised by the offer, but it wasn't the money that mattered to him. What really meant to him was that someone was finally taking responsibility for the mistake made and acknowledging the suffering he and his family went through. He decided to accept the compensation offer and use it to start his own nonprofit organization, which would help other people who had been unjustly imprisoned. He wanted to help change the criminal justice system so that others wouldn't have to go through what he went through. Rick spent the next few years working hard on his organization, which eventually became one of the most successful in the country. He traveled across the country, giving speeches and talking about the importance of justice and equality for all. He was invited to meet with the President of the United States, who recognized his work in defending civil rights and promised to work to improve the criminal justice system throughout the country. Rick's life had completely changed since he was unjustly arrested. He went from being a victim to a defender of justice, helping to change the system that harmed him. He learned that life can be unpredictable, but it is possible to turn a traumatic experience into an opportunity to make a difference in the world. And he proved that it is never too late to fight for justice and equality for all.